Today I have a video and it's titled Justice for Jennifer, and it is about marriage, divorce, and death. And it's basically a help for women in regards to, well, women in religious spheres where I think male authority figures are predominant and they're kind of in a vulnerable position where it's like they're subject to either a husband being in a position of authority or a shepherd being in a position of authority. And sometimes there's a lot of questions concerning marriage and divorce and women who are in bad marriages and not getting the help that they need. So hopefully this is a help for women, and hopefully it can provide education with navigating difficult situations. So here's an intro. The purpose of this series, like I said, to help the vulnerable, in this case women, and it's to educate and also provide helpful tools. So if you're not married, these would be good questions to ask men that you might be considering marrying, and questions to ask a pastor or a marriage counselor to gain insight of their convictions. Because I think everyone says the right words, like, biblical reasons for divorce are desertion and abandonment, but it's really vague and ambiguous, and there's no conviction. There's no qualifiers for what, or there's no examples about like what's the point of no return, at what threshold of desertion and abandonment would you say like it's good for a woman to leave? Because you can have abandonment in other ways, but it's like not past that threshold. Like your husband hasn't left the house and like completely deserted you, but maybe he's deserted you emotionally or spiritually. So questions like that. So hopefully with this PowerPoint, there's questions that are like specifics that you can ask someone you're considering marrying, maybe your current husband, someone, if you need marriage counseling, you can ask these to your marriage counselor to see what his convictions are, or a pastor. Just to gain insight for the men that you're going to be submitting to, so you can see what their convictions are. So you know what you're submitting to. Know who you're dealing with, and questions for potential spouse, current spouse, religious leader, counselor, ect. Who is Jennifer? Like the title, Justice for Jennifer. So Jennifer is the name that I'm giving the unnamed woman in Judges 19 through 20. She's the Levite's concubine who gets terribly abused and mistreated. It says that she's a concubine, but in Judges 20, the Levite is called her husband. So, yeah, Justice for Jennifer, that's the name that I'm giving the unnamed woman in at the end of Judges. So you could ask the open-ended question, like list out everything wrong with the Levite. You could have current husband, potential husband, pastor, like what's everything wrong with the Levite, with how he navigated that situation, what he said, what he did. Like, where do you see red flags in the Levite? What's wrong with how he treated his concubine, or neglected his concubine? So you can ask it open-endedly and see what comes back. And then if Jennifer was his wife, like they use the label concubine, different translations. I don't know Hebrew, but the translation says concubine, but there's also text that says that the Levite was her husband. So if explicitly Jennifer was his wife, at what point does she have biblical warrant to seek legal divorce? So if Jennifer and the Levite were married after she left her father's household, when he went and sought her, like throughout that whole account, like at what point would you say Jennifer has legal warrant to divorce at this point? or at what point ought she have pursued divorce? Like sometimes a lot of people say like, oh, just because you have biblical warrant to divorce doesn't mean you should. So you could ask like, at what point does she have warrant to divorce, and then at what point should she have divorced? So answers to those questions might kind of give you insight for the convictions in the man that you're talking to, that you're marrying or getting marriage counsel from. Those questions. So like at the end of that account, at the end of the series of events, she ends up dying in verse 28. So knowing that death brings about the end of the covenant, like when she died, like if she was married, Jennifer and the Levite, and she ends up dying, well, that death would put an end to that marriage covenant. So, like if Jennifer escaped after being handed over and before the abuse, would she be obligated to return back to the Levite? Like after he handed over his concubine, like that series of events ended in her death. So, like, do you think the death had to occur? Or, like, if she escaped before being abused, do you think she would have legal obligation to return to her husband? Or do you think God would require her to return to her husband in order to uphold the marriage covenant? So yeah, if she escaped after being handed over and before the abuse, would she be obligated to return? And then after the abuse, was she obligated to return to the Levite? So like between all these different scenarios, I would ask someone like, would God require her to go back to that man? Or like, because the actions resulted in death, does the death actually have to occur? Or is she required to go back to her husband? And then I would ask, how would you label the Levite's treatment towards Jennifer? And maybe you could go different instances, different things that he said, didn't do. How would you label his treatment towards her? And then like either specifically or overall. Does he love her, care for her? He wasn't perfect, but he did love her. He liked her. He hated her, etc. I would ask him, the men, like how would he describe that treatment of the Levite towards Jennifer? And then here is Judges 20, verses 3 through 5. Now the sons of Benjamin heard that the sons of Israel had gone up to Mizpah, and the sons of Israel said, "Tell us, how did this wickedness take place?" So the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, so here's the Levite's testimony of how Jennifer was murdered. "I came with my concubine to spend the night at Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, but the men of Gibeah rose up against me and surrounded the house at night because of me. They intended to kill me. Instead, they ravished my concubine so that she died." So I would ask them, like, how would you describe the Levite's testimony? Is there anything wrong with it? Anything left out? And then I would ask, who all is guilty of the murder of Jennifer? The Bible says, the woman who was murdered, who all is guilty of murder towards Jennifer? And here's the beginning of the account, verse 3 in Judges 19. "Then her husband arose and went after her to speak tenderly to her in order to bring her back, taking with him his servant and a pair of donkeys." I don't want to read through this whole account, so these are just verses, but you can read through Judges 19 through 20. I'm just going to talk about the verses. So that's when he went to go retrieve her. He spoke tenderly in order to bring her back. And then when after she was abused and she came back to the house, and when the Levite went to go leave and he sees her, he says, "Get up and let us go." So it's like speaking tenderly is now gone. When she was in her father's household, he spoke tenderly in order to bring her with him. But now when she's laying at the doorstep with her hand on the threshold and he's leaving, he says, "Get up and let us go." That's how he speaks to her then. So it's like different contexts change, he speaks differently regarding on the context. So, like if a man practices deception leading up to the marriage, is that marriage even valid in the eyes of God? So I would ask that to a potential husband, a pastor, a marriage counselor. If a man speaks tenderly to a woman in order to, like here, he spoke tenderly for the purpose of bringing her back. It wasn't genuine. It wasn't genuine affection. It was purposeful. He spoke this way to her in order to bring her back, in order to lure her to come with him, to get her to come with him. It was a tool. So if a man uses that, practices deception leading up to the marriage in order to obtain a wife, do you think that marriage is even valid in the eyes of God? Like if a man has performative empathy, if he's wearing a mask, if there's emotional manipulation involved, if he's acting a certain way due to an audience. Like here, the Levite spoke tenderly when like he's in her father's household. He comes with his camels. He presents himself as a established, respectable man in the presence of her and her father in order to bring her back. But once she's in his possession, the treatment changes. The speaking changes. The tender affections change. So if you have like a mask that's worn like in the pursuit of a woman, and then it's like once you're married and you've obtained what you wanted, if like the behavior changes, do you think that that's even considered a marriage in the eyes of God if deception is involved? Performing how you think the woman wants in order to get her to make a vow, if it's not genuine, putting on a show. Pretending to be something that you're not in order to get someone to make a vow to you. And then once that vow is made, it's like, well, now I don't have to put forth the effort. Like it's not genuine affection if you're only doing it to obtain someone. And then like once you have them, after they've given the vow, it's like if the effort changes, well, it wasn't genuine. It was just purposeful in order to obtain what they want. So like dealing treacherously versus dealing kindly. So her husband arose and went after her to speak tenderly to her in order to bring her back. Like marriages are like a covenant of kindness, a covenant dealing kindly with one another, not dealing deceit. It's like the difference between the two. You're either like dealing treacherously, deceitfully, dealing in a way where it's like you're against the other person, or you can deal kindly with them where it's like there's no deception, mutual respect, kindness towards the two parties. So like in this case, with the Levite and Jennifer, like if a man uses emotional manipulation as a tool in the procurement of a wife, would you say that's love or hatred? Is that informed consent? Like if a woman gives a vow to a husband and that husband has been like love bombing, pouring on an abundance of affection, emotions, like do you think that's informed consent if he's intentionally being away emotionally, that he's not able to uphold or withstand, and it's like out of his character, but he's doing this because he wants to get a wife, but it's not the real person? Is that informed consent? Would you say that's coercion? speaking tenderly to someone in order to have her make a vow to you, do you think that's coercion? And do you think that union is of the woman's own will? Or was she coerced, forced against her will? Or was she lured against her will? Here's a slide on emotional manipulation, performative empathy, love bombing. Do you think men who use manufactured affections to attract and lure women are the same as seductresses and harlots? The equivalent of women who dress sensually to appeal to men. I think and this is just my thoughts, I think the targeting nature of the practice makes it predatory. Like, men perform that way towards the woman they're looking to obtain. If you have an emotionally manipulative man, I think that's predatory. Because typically it's like they're emotionally manipulative towards the woman they want to obtain for themselves. It's targeted. They're only that way towards a specific person. As opposed to women, like if women dress in a way to appeal to like the lusts of men, it's like, well, they're doing that openly towards all men. It's not targeted. Women wear clothing to attract a man generally. Like typically a man isn't emotionally manipulative to every woman in his circle. He's only that way towards the ones that he wants to lure to himself. If the affection, empathy, and emotions are fake, does that make the men worse than the women whose body figures are in accord with reality? Like you could have a woman who dresses in a way where it's like she's intentionally trying to be sexually desirable towards men, but it's like that's real. What you're seeing is real. But men who are emotionally manipulative to attract like a specific woman, well, and if they're using like performative empathy, well, that's fake. So, like, which one's worse? Women who dress in a way to attract men in regards to their physical desires, or men faking emotions in order to attract women. But it's like you're luring them with falsehood. But at least with the women, it's real. And even if they have like fake stuff, it's still their actual bodies. Yeah. And then like this is from the verse, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So what God has joined together. Do you think all marriage unions are joined together by God? So these are questions you can ask husbands, pastors, officiants, marriage counselors, are all marriage unions joined together by God? Could there be a union with a marriage certificate where God wasn't involved in the joining of the two persons? Like if you have a couple with a marriage certificate issued by the civil magistrate, could that be present and God not being involved with that union? Yep. If a woman marries a baptized member of a church that holds to believers only baptism, so you have a church and their doctrine and practice is like, oh, we only baptize believers. So if a woman marries a baptized member of that church, the assumption is like, oh, well, if he's baptized and if he's a member of that church, well, he's a believer. So if a woman marries a baptized member of the church and then later discovers that the person is not a believer, are her vows still binding? And would you say that's informed consent? Like if she's making marriage vows to this person with the assumption that he's a believer because he's a baptized member of this church, and it's like, well, the religious leaders and their use of authority, like they wouldn't baptize him if he's not a believer. So if she like exercises trust and the authority of that congregation, and it's like, oh, well, if they baptized him, he's a believer. So if she gives vows based off of that premise, but he's not a believer, do you think her vows are still binding? And is that informed consent? Because marriage vows are made to a person. You have to know them. And it's like they have to be made in accord with truth. Like if that person projects an image and there's like falsehood, he's like pretending to be a certain way, but it's not who he actually is as a person. Well, it's like you're making marriage vows to an image. You're making marriage vows to the image that they project. They're pretending to be something that they're not. So, like marriage vows, you have to know the person. You're making vows to a person, and if that person is putting on a mask or putting forth an image that's not who they are, I have a difficult time seeing how like those vows are binding. Like you make vows to a person, and yeah, you don't know like everything about the person, but like generally, like, oh, this person's a believer. Like that's a big, like what if you had a transgender person, like a male that had surgery and became a female, and that female then married a man in the church. And then later the man found out like, oh, this person was born a man and then transitioned into a woman. I didn't know that. Do you think that man's vows are binding, or do you think they're not binding because, like, do you think that's informed consent? If the transgender person withheld knowledge like that, knowing like, oh, if this person knew certain things, they wouldn't make these vows towards me. Or it may be even ignorance. Maybe you don't know, like, oh, I didn't think it would be a big deal, but then it's revealed and it's like, oh no, this is a big deal. If I had known this, I wouldn't have married you. Yeah, so do you think like those vows are binding if you give vows to someone thinking, oh, they were a naturally born woman and they've always been a woman, versus, oh, they were born with male genitalia and then they transitioned to a woman? Do you think the man's vows are still binding, or would you consider like that marriage annulled or invalid, void? Again, these questions are just to see what the convictions are. Like everyone's going to have different convictions, probably on a spectrum. What would they consider? It's just to know like the mind of who you're marrying, who's officiating, who's giving you counsel, what their convictions are. People are going to have different convictions on this. There's going to be a whole spectrum. You have liberty of conscience to believe what you want. So I'm not saying there's a right answer or a wrong answer, but it's like, yeah, hopefully it's to help be a helpful aid. Authority, accountability. So what would accountability look like for the person in a position of religious authority if they administered an ordinance unlawfully and sinfully and they baptized an unbeliever? So if you have a congregation that holds to believers only baptism, and the pastor, the person of religious authority, if they baptized an unbeliever, well, that's an unlawful use of that ordinance. That's a sinful use of that ordinance. That pastor sinned when applying that seal to someone that it shouldn't have been applied to. So if a pastor did that and then they officiated a wedding unlawfully and sinfully between a baptized believer and a baptized unbeliever, like a person in, religious authority, a believer is only to be married to another believer. So if they officiated a wedding where they united a believer to an unbeliever, well, that's a unlawful use of that authority. That's a sinful use of that authority. So if you have someone, a pastor, that sinned with their use of authority, with baptism and officiating a wedding, if a religious leader uses his authority in an unlawful and sinful way that resulted in much damage and harm to an individual, should that leader seek to make amends and restitution for the damage that their sin caused others? if they sinned in their use of authority and that sin resulted in harm and damage towards someone in their congregation, towards another person, like what would accountability look like for that person in a position of authority? So you can ask that to your pastor, a marriage counselor, someone you're seeking to marry. Yeah. To what extent are they, with their authority, with much authority should come much accountability. To much who is given, much will be required. So questions like that, you can kind of gauge the level of care that a pastor puts into his use of authority. If it's like he doesn't hold himself accountable for the decisions that he makes and what he does with his authority, well, it's like if he's kind of careless, you probably shouldn't put a lot of trust in that. You probably shouldn't put a lot of weight on that. If he doesn't care about the consequences of his actions, I wouldn't put a lot of weight in that if he's careless. And here's Malachi 2. Yet you say, for what reason? Because the Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth. So this passage is used a lot where, God hates divorce. The Lord has been a witness between you and the wife of your youth, against whom you have dealt treacherously, though she is your companion and your wife by covenant. But not one has done so who has a remnant of the Spirit. And what did that one do while he was seeking a godly offspring? Take heed then to your spirit, and let no one deal treacherously against the wife of your youth, for I hate divorce, says the Lord God of Israel. So I would also ask then, do you think someone who deals treacherously against their wife is a believer? Like here it explicitly says, but not one has done so who has a remnant of the Spirit. So it's like, how would you exercise spiritual care towards a husband who is abusive towards his wife, who deals treacherously towards his wife? Like, would you treat them as a believer towards a non-believer? Would you disfellowship them? How would your response be to this person? Would you agree that, someone who deals treacherously with their wife by covenant, either, I think this principle also applies towards pastors. Like if you have a husband that betrays his wife, or a pastor who deals treacherously with a member of their congregation, I think that would also be indicative that they don't have a remnant of the Spirit. If that member is part of their congregation by covenant and the pastor deals treacherously towards the members, I don't think they have a remnant of the Spirit. But questions from this passage. So I would ask, what brings about divorce? From the passage, let no one deal treacherously, for I hate divorce. Do you think a wife filing divorce is what brings about divorce? Or do you think a husband's treason, betrayal, sin against his wife is what brings about divorce? If a wife is pursuing legal divorce, should the attention be on her? You shouldn't divorce your husband because God hates divorce. Well, is her, divorce is the, don't deal treacherously, for I hate divorce. Divorce is the reasonable response towards betrayal, treason, dealing treacherously. So if a wife is now responding to a husband's conduct with pursuing divorce, she's doing what's natural towards that behavior. If someone betrays their wife and deals treacherously, well, divorce is the natural consequence. We shouldn't be victim blaming and criticizing women who are pursuing. That's not where the attention should be. That's what I believe. So, and it's a wife filing divorce isn't oh, she wanted to divorce. You divorced your wife if you dealt treacherously to her. If you betrayed your wife, if you dealt treacherously to your wife, you're the one that divorced her. You severed that relationship. If she's now filing with the civil magistrate for a divorce, that's just paperwork. You're the one that brought about the divorce, your conduct, your sin, your betrayal, your treason. You can't, don't abuse your wife and then make her, and then play the victim of like, oh, she left me, she divorced me. You need to acknowledge your conduct. If they make your response the issue instead of their own sin, that's manipulation. They make your response the problem as opposed to their actions that cause the response. What brings about divorce, and then when does divorce occur in the marriage? So when does divorce occur in the marriage? Is it when a husband commits acts of treason and betrayal against his wife? Is that when divorce occurs? Or is it when the civil magistrate issues a certificate of divorce? Like if you have a married couple and then the husband deals treacherously against his wife, and then that wife, as a response, files for divorce, and then she's issued a divorce by the state. Like, at what point does divorce occur in that marriage? In the eyes of God, or in the eyes of God is when it matters. So I would ask your husband, the marriage counselor, the pastor, like, when does divorce occur? Is it when the husband commits an act of treason? Or is it when the wife files for divorce? Or is it when the divorce certificate is issued? When does the divorce actually occur? And who caused it? And I would also ask them, like, what acts would you consider dealing treacherously? Like, what's the standard? If, abandonment and desertion or physical abuse are causes for divorce, and if those are dealing treacherously, like, what, at what threshold would you say it is to deal treacherously against the wife of your youth? And a warning for husbands, God will deal with you in same measure to how you deal with your wife. Like, if she's the weaker vessel, well, you're weaker when compared to God. And like here at the beginning of Malachi, you cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping and with groaning, because he no longer regards the offering or accepts it with favor from your hand. It's like if a husband is covering the altar of the Lord with the tears and weeping and groaning, and like the Lord doesn't hear it, well, that's because your wife probably has been crying out in tears, weeping and groaning, and it's like you didn't regard that. You didn't live with your wife with understanding. You didn't give heed to your wife's cries. Because you didn't give heed to your wife's cries, well, now, like, the Lord doesn't regard your offering also, although you cover the altar of the Lord with tears, with weeping, and with groaning. And here's 1 Peter 3:7. You husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. So, the instruction, live with your wife in an understanding way, and he gives the purpose for it, so that your prayers will not be hindered. If you don't hear the words of your wife and respond to them in a way where it's like positive, like if your wife is asking for something and it's like you don't receive those words and respond in a way where it's like it answers what she's asking, well, your prayers are going to be hindered too. If you're not receptive to your wife's words, your wife's heart, your wife's feelings, if you're not dwelling with her with understanding, well, the Lord is not going to dwell with you in that way. If you don't give ear to your wife's words, well, God is not going to give ear to your words. With like that authority structure, like if you have authority over your wife, but you're not considerate of her words, well, why should God be considerate of your prayers? Like if that's how you treat your wife, why should God treat you that way? God is retributive. So that's a warning for husbands. But I mean, like with curses and negative consequences, like the same is true with blessings. If you bless your wife with an abundance according to your means, well, God will treat you in that same manner. If you want an abundant life from the hand of God, will seek to give your wife an abundance. Don't withhold. Seek to satisfy all the desires of her heart, and God will treat you in that same way. So that was a warning for husbands, and this is a warning for anyone. He who shuts his ear to the cry of the poor will also cry himself and not be answered. And then Luke 6:38, give and it will be given to you. They will pour into your lap a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over. For by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. So poor, it could be like weaker in strength, weaker in positions of authority, weaker in terms of influence, weaker in social classes. And if that weaker person is crying out and you shut your ear to it, well, when you cry out to God, it's not going to be answered. Like if you don't give ear to the cries of the poor, well, God's not going to give ear to your cries. You're poor in the eyes of God. You're weaker in the eyes of God. God is stronger. And it's like if you want God to answer your cries, it's like, well, you should answer the cries of people who are weaker than you. And it's like, yeah. Our world is backwards. It's like when someone of influence cries out, it's like, oh, we all give heed to those cries. It's like we respect them. We give them favorable treatment. We respond to their cries for help. But it's like, no, like if we are to imitate God, it's like God only blesses downward. God doesn't give aid to those who are stronger than him. God only helps the weak. God only hears the cry of the poor, of those weaker than him. Blessings flow downward. Like that's the order of we see in creation. Like rain falls downward, blessings fall downward. So you're to be a blessing of those who are weaker than you, not upwards. That's flattery. You're doing that for selfish ambition. If you bless upwards, not that you can't honor them, but yeah, you should help the weak, not the strong. You can help the strong, but yeah. So, revocation of wives, having your wives revoked from your care and possession. So this is a question for husbands. To what extent do you think you're entitled to wife privileges, regardless of your treatment of her? Like, I think I've only heard it like, well, God hates divorce. Yeah, God does hate divorce, but he also has a practice of reallocating wives to other husbands. So God isn't, he hates divorce, but he's not completely against it. And he will reallocate wives to those who are faithful with that resource. If you're not going to care for your wife in an appropriate way, well, he cares for your wife. That's an image bearer. He's going to reallocate that resource to someone who will be faithful with her, someone who will be thankful and care for her in the way that she ought to be cared for. So to what extent do you think you're entitled to wife privileges, regardless of your treatment of her? Are you blind to the reality that God can remove your wife from your care at any time and entrust her to a more capable man? Like if if you have a wife that separates from you and pursues divorce, and it's like she is provided a new husband from God, like, do you think you're the victim of like, oh, she left me, she abandoned me? My wife was supposed to love me unconditionally, but she left me to marry a new man. Like, do you think like that's of your wife's doing, or do you think it could be a consequence to your treatment of her? Like, if you treated her poorly, do you think her departure and then attachment to a different man, do you think that could have been by the hand of God, reallocating your wife to someone else? So here's Jeremiah 8:10. Therefore, I will give their wives to others, their fields to new owners, because from the least even to the greatest, everyone is greedy for gain. So if you're pursuing these things with selfish ambition, you're greedy for gain, your fields, your wives, if it's like you have them for selfish ambition and you're not concerned over how you care for your wife and how you care for your field, well, God can remove them and give them to new owners. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil. So this is with David. I will raise up evil against you from your own household. I will even take your wives before your eyes and give them to your companion, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. So yeah, God does hate divorce. So you shouldn't deal treacherously with the wife of your youth, but God also is not restrictive to, like, he can take your wife and give her to someone else. He hates divorce, but he's not against reallocating resources. Here's another quote that I think I mentioned it earlier. So, in the Reform circle that I'm in that form of Christianity, just because a wife has biblical warrant to divorce doesn't mean she should. So here's my thoughts. If a man treats his wife poorly, then her remaining presence under his authority will be a cause of negative consequences to the husband from God. Like, if a man doesn't know how to render proper care to his wife and he treats her poorly, he mistreats her, he abuses her, well, God's going to render justice to that man. God's going to treat that man in similar manner that he's treating his wife. So that wife, if she was to remain there, well, it's going to be a source of negative consequences. If he, curses his wife, he's going to receive curses from God. So it's in the best interest of the husband for the wife to depart and not remain in a situation where she is mistreated and abused. Separation from abusive men is the loving thing to do to them. Like, if they don't know how to care for a wife and that wife is being emotionally, spiritually, physically abused, well, separating from that man, departing from that man, is loving towards them. Like, if a wife is to render like unconditional love to her husband, well, and it's like, you need wisdom in your situation, but it could be unloving to remain there because your presence, if he continues to abuse you, well, he's just earning more like unfavorable consequences from God. So it's like, because this is a source of the man like storing up judgment, well, you could look and be like, well, I love you, and therefore that's why I'm removing myself from your presence. It is an act of love. It's for your good so that you don't continue to store up judgment before God because of how you treat your wife. Yep. It's not the same when you have a godly man and an abusive wife. So if you have an abusive husband and a godly wife, well, because that husband is abusive towards the wife, it's like, well, God is going to be, he's going to render that same care towards the husband. God will, be just towards that. But if you have a godly man and an abusive wife, and it's like the wife is abusing the husband, it's different, because it's not like God's going to, he will render judgment, but it's not the same. because of the authority structure and physical strength. So if a husband, curses towards his wife, he merits him to receive curses from God. A wife's curses towards her husband merits her to receive curses from her children. So that's kind of like the authority structure. So it's like if you have an abusive wife towards your husband, it's not like that husband should depart, because the consequences aren't as severe as like a husband abusing his wife. The judgment's more severe for a husband abusing his wife than a wife abusing her husband. So, and here in like First Peter, and you could like ask them, like your pastors, your marriage counselors, your husband, like this is what I think. Like, do they agree or do they disagree? You can just use this as talking points to see what their mind is, what their convictions are, what their perspective is, how their thinking is, what their view is. This verse in 1 Peter. In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives, as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. So the call for wives to submit to disobedient husbands is so that husbands have an example they can observe, and by observing that example, they're able to imitate it. Like with Jesus, like I do the works that I see with my Father. And with the disciples, he's like, I gave you an example of how you are to love, how you are to follow, what you are to imitate. So if you have a disobedient husband towards God, and it's like there's no, it's like so, and there's like no good examples. He doesn't know how to obey God. He's not obeying God. Well, with the wife submitting to her husband, you're giving the husband an example they can observe, like they can see, and by seeing that example, well, that should equip them to imitate it. Giving them an example that they can observe and imitate. It's further light. So her example, it's like that behavior, that example, it's further light. And if they remain disobedient to God, then the judgment will be all the more severe. So if you have a disobedient husband and a disobedient wife, well, he's still going to be judged as disobedient to God. But if you have a disobedient husband and obedient wife, it's like, well, you've received the light from your wife. You've seen her example of what obedience should look like. And you weren't able to imitate that. You didn't obey God's word, and you weren't, you even had a good example, and you weren't able to imitate that example. So that's further light that the disobedient husband is rejecting. And with, the rejection of more light, the consequences are more severe. And if your wife is able to offer submission to you, a corrupt man, what reason will you have for not being able to offer submission and respect towards a perfect and good God? Like at the judgment, God's going to point to your wife and say, like, look, she was able to submit to an ungodly husband, a corrupt man. What excuse do you have for not being able to offer submission to God? And be mindful of the standard and expectation you place over your wife and children. Don't require a level of obedience that you yourself aren't able to render to God. Like if your expectation is that wives are to render this level of submission and obedience to you, wives, children, or even if you're a pastor, if you have this level of expectation of obedience that you think your congregants are to render to you, and if they don't obey like the commandments of men, it's like that's severe in your eyes, that they're not rendering to you like perfect obedience. Like if that's your standard over your congregants, or like a husband's standard over his wife, or parents over children, like you're going to be held to that same standard with God. Like whatever standard you want God to hold you to, hold that to other people. And then I have the reference from Luke. With the same measure you give, it's going to be measured to you. So don't require something from others if you can't render that to God. Don't tie up heavy burdens that you yourself can't lift. So these are questions in regards to certificates, like marriage certificates, divorce certificates, death certificates. Can a marriage occur without a marriage certificate? Like, can God join two people together without having a marriage certificate issued by the civil magistrate? Or do you think that marriage certificate is what makes people married? And can a divorce occur without a divorce certificate? Or is it like until someone has that divorce certificate, they're not divorced? And can a death occur without a death certificate? I would answer yes to all of those questions. And then like the other 3 points, do individuals sometimes obtain a marriage certificate to accomplish a purpose while remaining unmarried in substance? I would say yes. Do married couples sometimes obtain a divorce certificate to accomplish certain purposes while remaining married in substance? I would say yes. And do the living sometimes fake their death and obtain a death certificate in order to accomplish certain purposes while remaining alive? I would also say yes. This is just kind of to point out how the certificates are kind of vain. Not that I think marriage is just a sheet of paper, but there's like this other ditch of like, oh, if we have the paper, then that's reality. As long as I have a marriage certificate, we're married and you can't convince me otherwise. As opposed to, or like until we obtain a divorce degree, like we're not divorced. It's like, well, if a husband deals treacherously and betrays his wife, well, that severs the relationship. That renders the marriage divorced. I think the certificate from the civil magistrate, I think that's just filing paperwork. But you can ask these questions and see what your future husband or your future wife or your pastor or your marriage counselor, like, what do they think? Like, do you, like a religious leader who maybe officiates over a wedding, do they think that their authority is required in order for God to join two people together? Or could God join two people together and those people be married without having to go to, like, without having that marriage declared and officiated by a religious leader? Or do they think that the ceremony has to be performed by a person in position of religious authority in order for that marriage to be valid in the eyes of God? Personally, I think the practice of marriage certificates is unbiblical. It's not in the Bible. It's not biblical language. It's not a biblical term. It's not a biblical concept. Where does it say marriage certificates? Talks about marriage and marriage ceremonies, but it never talks about a marriage certificate. I think it's unbiblical. And I think divorce certificates, let him, why did Moses say that we could give a certificate of divorce? Because of the hardness of your hearts. Like, it talks about divorce certificates, but not marriage certificates. And I think divorce certificates were issued to women for the purpose of physical evidence. There was physical evidence that the woman was married, so the certificate was physical evidence to testify of the divorce, to prove that there was a divorce. And it says, let him give his wife a certificate of divorce. It's not like the husband gets a certificate of divorce. The certificate goes to the wife because she has evidence, physical evidence, that she was married, that she had been with a man at one time. So it's like, you need that physical evidence that the husband has sent her away, that she's no longer married, that she's free to be married and it's not adultery. Like from a different man's perspective, it's like if they see a woman that has been, that there's evidence that she was at one time married, it's like, well, I can see that you were married at one point. How can I know that you're divorced? So I think the divorce certificate given to women is like the physical evidence to testify of the divorce. And I think this is said often in marriage vows, till death do us part. So like, and it's like a covenant is ended when like one of the parties has died. So if death of one of the parties puts an end to that covenant, like let's say they were married and then one of them dies, like Jennifer, the Levite's concubine, like her death would have put an end to that marriage covenant. So, like, how would they biblically define death? And this is how I would define it biblically, because it's in Matthew. So here we have the example of, this is Jairus' daughter, the synagogue official. Jairus, he had a daughter, and she was dying. So here's, it's in Matthew, Luke, John, 3 different accounts, and it's described in different ways. So Luke, the physician, he states she was dying. So she was in the process of dying physically. That's how Luke, the physician, describes that account and the state of the daughter, that she was dying. And then in Mark, he quotes what Jairus had said to Jesus. He said, "My little daughter is at the point of death." So it's like Jairus knew his daughter, she's at the point of death. She was sick. She's at the point of death, the point of no return. She's not going to be recovered. She's at the point of death. She hasn't died yet, but she's at like the point of death. Death is imminent. But Matthew, when he describes it, he quotes Jairus' words as, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her and she will live." So Matthew is the inspired word of God. He records Jairus' statement. Like I think Jairus, his literal words were, maybe not, because with Mark it says saying. So it's like, I think saying implies like this is the concept that he was communicating. He was basically saying this. But with Matthew, where it says the synagogue official said, "My daughter has just died." So I think being at the point of death is, you could say that you died. If you were at the point of death and there was like no hope of recovery, and then like God healed you and raised you up, I think that's like you had died. If you were at the point of no return and there was no hope, and if left to yourself, like if God hadn't intervened, like you would have died. I think that's the equivalent of death. Just because God prevented that actual death from occurring, if you were at the point of death and then God intervened so that you didn't die, I think that's the same. Like you could say like you died. I don't think that death actually has to take place. Like knowing that death would have been like the natural result. I think that's evidence enough to say like, no, I died. Therefore, like death puts an end to the covenant. Yep. Yep. At the point of death is dying. My daughter has just died. Yep. So I think men need a lot of help. Men need help. So here at the end of Luke, and following him was a large crowd of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me." But weep for yourselves and for your children. So you have these women, they're following Jesus, they're mourning and lamenting Jesus, knowing what's about to take place and the suffering that he's about to incur, and they're weeping for him. And his response is, daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Like, instead of crying for the suffering I'm about to receive, your tears would be better spent crying for yourself and for your children. Why? For behold, the days are coming when they, men, will say, blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. And they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills cover us. For if they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it's dry? So he's commanding the women, like, stop weeping for me and weep for yourselves and for your children. Cry for what you're about to receive. Cry for the suffering that you're going to have to incur, the suffering that you're going to incur from the hands of men. Because how they view women. They think women's value is based off of their bodies. Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. So because of how men view women and treat women and the suffering that women receive that gets inflicted upon them by men who have this mindset, it's like we should rather weep for ourselves and for our children rather than weep for the sufferings that Jesus is experiencing, or in their case, the sufferings he's about to experience. In our case, it's looking back, weeping for the sufferings that he did experience. Because the sufferings that women are going to receive from the hands of men, it's going to be worse. So he's commanding them, weep for yourselves and for your children. You should cry for the suffering that you're about to receive from the hands of men who view women in this way. Weep for yourselves. And here's another example in Matthew 15, like when men are uncaring and unempathetic towards women and the needs of women, and it's like men have this entitled mindset and their needs are elevated and put above everyone else's. And they have this like narcissistic, prideful, arrogant, entitled disposition in their mindset. So here, like in Matthew 15, verse 22 through 23, you have the Canaanite woman. She came to Jesus and she's crying out, saying, have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed. So you have this woman crying out, weeping, because her daughter is cruelly demon-possessed. She has this suffering. She has this need. She's advocating on behalf of her daughter. Her daughter is being like cruelly tormented, being possessed by a demon, and she's seeking deliverance for her daughter. And that's why she's crying out towards Jesus. And Jesus didn't answer because he thought it was outside of the bounds of what was lawful. And then the disciples came to Jesus and they're imploring him, saying, send her away because she keeps shouting at us. Like just the mindset of his disciples, probably men. It says disciples here, but probably all men. It's like they can't be bothered. It's like a noise complaint. This woman's crying out because of the suffering that her daughter is experiencing, and they're imploring Jesus because of the suffering they're experiencing by having to hear the woman shouting. Like the woman coming and crying and asking for help, it's like that's a bother to them. They need deliverance from the woman crying out and asking for help. The woman's crying out because of the suffering of her daughter, and then Jesus' disciples are crying out because they're having to hear the cries of the woman. They don't want to have to hear that. She's bothering them. She's crying out for help, and they're like, send her away, imploring Jesus, send her away because she keeps shouting at us. It's like the woman wants deliverance for her daughter of the demon, and it's like the disciples want deliverance from the woman. The woman wants Jesus to cast out the demon from her daughter, and the disciples want Jesus to cast out this woman. It's like they're equating her to a demon. Her crying out, asking for help is like the equivalent of the torment from being demon possessed. It's like they don't understand someone's needs, the suffering that they're experiencing versus the suffering that other people are experiencing. Just this entitled privilege. This woman is shouting at us. She's bothering us. Please send her away. And they don't consider the sufferings that other people are experiencing and what their needs are. And that's what it means to be king. Like God hears, like our king will hear our cries and save us and give help to us. Like if you have someone who doesn't hear the cries of others and want to respond and deliver them from what they're crying out about, well, you shouldn't be king. Kings hear the cries for help and they respond and they render aid and they render care. So if they can't even hear the cries of those that need help, well, you're unfit to be king. I would say that the standard is set so low, but I don't even think there is a standard from what I've witnessed in the religious circles that I've been in. There's no standard for men. They can lie and not be held accountable. Pastors can lie. Pastors can teach falsely. Pastors can give poisonous examples that will lead to the destruction of others if they were to imitate it and not be held accountable. There's no standard. And I think men just look around and they're like, well, everyone else is doing it too. And you guys are just in a downward spiral of being unprincipled. Just giving yourself over to corruption. Unprincipled men following and being led by unprincipled men. I can't say it's a low standard. Like from what I've seen, there is no standard. If a pastor has like an unbroken pattern of lying, and it's like unconfessed, and even when it's shown to them, it's like they don't confess it. Like, I don't know. I feel like lying is a big one. When you lie, you make yourself out to be a son of Satan. So if you have congregations and they make lying permissible and they're not going to hold someone accountable, like, oh, you should confess that lie and seek forgiveness. There's no standard if you just permit lying, and you can lie and not be held accountable and it's not a big deal. So here's a book that I read that was really helpful regarding abuse. So like narcissistic abuse, emotional abuse, spiritual abuse, psychological abuse. It talks about, it covers those topics, and it was helpful for me. And like abuse is it's evil, demonic, and of Satan. And here's James 3. Like because I've described certain conduct as demonic, and then people's response is like, oh, you call it demonic? Like, they'll rebuke you for not using biblical language, but then when you ascribe the biblical language towards that conduct that the Bible uses, it's like, well, they guilt you over that too. Like, why would you say it's demonic, Rebecca? Why would you say that? Well, that's the word the Bible uses. James 3. Yep. This wisdom is not that which comes down from above, but is earthly, natural, and demonic. So this is in regards to being teachers too. Yep. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there is disorder and every evil thing. And when you look at like abuse, either spiritual abuse from like pastors or husbands or people around you, like covert narcissists, wolves in sheep's clothing. It's like they rule by fear, intimidation, guilt, shame, emotional manipulation, emotional harm, and it's like it's the tactics of demons. It's like Satan rules by fear and guilt and shame and intimidation, and worry, and death. Yeah, it's very demonic. Especially when you have like psychological abuse and you have people gaslighting you and lying and fabricating stories and rewriting the past. That's satanic. Like when you operate in falsehood and deceit, like it's demonic. It's satanic. It's a lie. A huge red flag. Super toxic. So also I want to touch on mental health and suicide, because when you have toxic environments where there's abuse, either like spiritual abuse, if you have like a spiritually abusive shepherd, or like a friend group or a social group, or like family dynamics, if you have someone who's abusive, like emotionally, spiritually, or psychologically, well, that environment can bring about mental issues in others. Being in an environment with toxic people can be the cause for mental illness in others, especially if they're heavy into psychological abuse, deception, lying, and gaslighting. Because sometimes someone can have a mental illness come up, and it's like, oh, they're crazy, they're insane, they're bipolar, There's all these symptoms of someone having mental illness. Well, sometimes that mental illness can be brought about because of the environment that they're in. If you have someone who's psychologically abusive, and it's like they're constantly, oh, that didn't happen. Oh, that's not what happened. Like, if you have someone inflicting harm to someone's mind, well, that can bring about mental illness. So if you see someone with mental illness, it could be a result of abuse with those around them and the conduct of those around them. Psychological abuse, deception, lying, and gaslighting. And with emotional abuse, so I've seen it where, like, in marriages, like this is a form of emotional abuse where your emotional needs are irrelevant while the sexual lusts are a must. So like typically a woman, if she has emotional needs, relational needs, it's like, well, those are irrelevant. Those are just wants. You're being selfish. You're being needy. But the husband, like his physical lusts are a must. Like you're to provide for your husband's physical needs. It's not even needs, like marriage is a gift. It's like you're to, fulfill your husband's sexual lusts, but your emotional needs aren't a priority. There's no, there's no standard for a husband to ensure that he's meeting the emotional needs of his wife or the relational needs of his wife. But if a wife isn't meeting her husband's needs, it's like, you're a bad wife. You're failing as a wife. You're withholding. You're disobeying God. Another form of emotional abuse, if making your response the problem rather than the actions and cruelty that caused it, that's also emotional abuse. Like if someone did something, said something, had a series of events that resulted in you having an emotional response, you got upset, you cried, maybe you got provoked to anger. If they make your response the problem as opposed to their actions that caused the response, that's emotional abuse. Like if people say hurtful things and that causes you to respond emotionally and cry and be hurt over it, well, that's good. You should you should have a feeling heart that's sensitive to the words of others. But if they're not willing to take, be accountable for the way that they are harming your inner man, your spirit, your mind, your heart, instead of taking accountability for their actions, it's like, no, it's easier just to make you the problem. Your response is the problem, not my actions that caused it. Also, if someone says you're too sensitive or too emotional, that's also emotional abuse. Yep. And yep. So being in this environment, it can be the cause for why someone has mental health issues, and it can also be the cause for why someone commits suicide. And it is interesting when the abuse peaks during a specific season, such as being postpartum. Could be a random coincidence, or it could be calculated. Could be calculated intent to further hide their abuse and convince you that you're the problem. So typically, like postpartum, women are can be more susceptible towards emotional sensitivities, having a state of depression, having fluctuations in hormones. So when you have emotionally abusive people, and it peaks at a time where a woman is in a state where it's like they're known for experiencing emotional fluctuations. It is interesting. It could be coincidence, or it could be calculated to convince you that you're the problem. Their conduct isn't the problem. You're just so emotional. You're postpartum. That's the issue. It's like they have that scapegoat to further hide their conduct. And if someone says you're too sensitive, like here's Psalm 33, 13 through 15. The Lord looks from heaven. He sees all the sons of men. From his dwelling place he looks out on all the inhabitants of the earth. He who fashions the hearts of them all. He who understands all their works. Like God fashions the heart of every man. He fashions the hearts of them all the sons of men. He fashions all of their hearts. So when someone grumbles, complains, criticizes, and finds fault with the emotional composition of another, you're too sensitive, you're too emotional, you're too emotionally needy, well, that's like their emotional composition of another. That's an expression of contempt towards their maker. Like if you're criticizing their emotional composition, you're criticizing their maker. Like God shapes and forms the heart of every man. So if this is how someone's heart currently is, it's sensitive, it's emotional, there are emotional needs that this person has. Like if you're criticizing that, you're grumbling, you're complaining, you find fault, you're criticizing how their heart is fashioned, well, you're criticizing their maker. It's God who has fashioned their heart. He's made it sensitive or emotional, whatever extent that it is. God has fashioned that person's heart. So if you criticize it and find fault in it and speak about that person with contempt because how their heart is, your issues with their maker. Also, you're too sensitive. If a husband says that about his wife, it's a confession that he's not equipped to render the adequate care and provide the necessary emotional support his wife requires. Like if a husband says, I can't handle this, or if he says like, you're too sensitive, what he's basically saying is like, you're too sensitive, I can't handle this. I'm not prepared to have a wife. I lack the maturity and development necessary to be given a wife. If women are too emotional, too sensitive, if men can't handle it, if men can't handle your emotions, if men can't handle your sensitivities, well, then they're not prepared to have a wife. They're not able to render the adequate care that you need. They can't provide emotional support. So don't entrust your heart to them. Don't render affections. Don't render love and care and concern towards that man if he thinks you're too sensitive. Like, if he can't handle your heart and its emotional needs, well, don't render your heart to him. If your heart and your emotions, if you're too emotional, if you're too sensitive for that man to render adequate care for, well, then he can't handle it. So don't give your heart to him. Don't render affections to him. Don't give him the benefits of your emotional, too sensitive heart if he can't handle it. Yeah, it's a confession that that he can't handle it, that he's ill-equipped to care for that person and their emotional needs if they're too sensitive or too emotional. Yeah, so, and then like Matthew 25, for it will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted to them his property. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, to another 1, to each according to his ability. So God gives stewardship, entrusts property, each according to his ability. So if a man says, you're too sensitive, you're too emotional, like I don't have the ability to handle this, it's too much for me. Well, I think that statement is a confession that that union wasn't of God, because God gives to each according to his ability. So if a man is saying like this wife's emotional needs are above my ability, well, that wife wasn't given to you by God then, because God gives according to his abilities. So God's not going to give you a wife that has emotional needs that you're not able to meet. So if you're saying your wife has emotional needs, she's too sensitive, she's too emotional, her emotions are too much for you to handle, well, that union, I don't think was of God then. It wasn't God that gave that woman to you. He wouldn't give you a wife. He wouldn't entrust you with a wife that whose care was more than your ability. So if you're saying her needs are too much and it's outside your ability, well, I don't think that woman was given to you by God then. I don't think God joined you two together. Because God gives to each according to his ability. Yep. So if a husband has made that assessment regarding his wife, then that might be an indication that the union was not of God. You were not joined together by man, or you were joined together by man. You were not joined together by God. So this talks about source, like if a marriage is of God or if a marriage is of man. And like here it's used with authority, spiritual authority. So they're asking Jesus, by what authority are you doing these things? And he asked them, the baptism of John was from what source? From heaven or from man? So he's asking them, like the spiritual authority that John the Baptist had, was that, like what was the source of that? Was that from heaven, from God, or was it from man? So those are the only two sources, above or below, of God or of man. And they responded by saying, we don't know. So like a marriage, I think the source could also be one of those two things. I don't think every marriage is of God. I think you have unions that are of God, that have God as the source, and you have marriages whose source is of man. Man joined those two people together. And God wasn't involved in the joining of those two people. And if someone states that God performed a marriage when God was not active in that work, that's taking God's name in vain. So if you have someone claiming God joined these two people together, but God didn't actually join those two people together. Hey, Jeff. Yeah, so if someone states that God performed a marriage when God was not active in that work, that's taking God's name in vain. So if you have someone saying that God joined these two people together when God didn't actually join those two people together, that's taking God's name in vain. That's blasphemy. You're putting God's name on a work and a union that God wasn't involved in. To say God joined these two people together, like if that union wasn't of God, that's blasphemy. It's taking the Lord's name in vain. And then I have Exodus 27. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not leave him unpunished who takes his name in vain. So you can have people, you could have a union between two people and they could be married, but the source of that marriage was man. Man joined those two people together and not God. Just because there's a marriage certificate doesn't mean that God joined those two people together. And like here it is, like here, this also talks about like the source. Is the source from man or is the source from God? So this talks about like spiritual authority. And here it's in regards to prophets, teachers. Like I'm sure those prophets made claims that, they were of God. But God explicitly says, like, I did not send these prophets, but they ran. I did not speak to them, but they prophesied. So God is saying, like, I'm not the source of these false prophets. I did not send them. They did not come from me. I'm not the source of these prophets. These prophets are going out, speaking on behalf of God, speaking corruption and falsehood, the deception of their own hearts. And God is saying, like, I'm not the source. It's like they sent themselves. Man is the source. So if you have like a prophet, a false teacher, well, God did not send them. Their source is not of God. Their source is of man. They sent themselves. So if you have false teachers who officiate a wedding, like that ceremony, that union, that marriage, I don't think you can say, well, that's of God. I think it's of man. Man joined those two people together. If their religious authority is fake, I don't think they have declarative power to say, I now pronounce you husband and wife. If they weren't sent by God, it's of man. It's not of God. Then I said, not every pastor, shepherd, prophet, or teacher is sent by God. Just because someone claims to have authority given to them by God doesn't make it true. And then I have John 3:34. For he whom God has sent speaks the words of God, for he gives the Spirit without measure. And some people might say, like, well, I'm not claiming to be a prophet. I'm a pastor or I'm a teacher. Well, like 2 Peter 2:1, it equates prophet and teacher. Like just as there were false prophets, there will be false teachers among you. So to say you're a teacher or to say like, oh, this doesn't apply to me, I'm not claiming to be a prophet, I'm a teacher. It's like the same concept. Again, with mental health and suicide. So I was reading this book, Peacekeeper, and at the beginning, he has this the slippery slope, this chart where he talks about the responses to conflict. And when I first read this book, it talks about how sometimes people, with conflict, some people will have an escape response, like they want to avoid conflict. And on the severe end of escape responses, you have suicide. And when I first saw that page, I was like, suicide as an escape response to conflict. It seems a little excessive. Seems a little dramatic. Seems a little extreme. I don't understand how, conflict could make someone commit suicide, resort to death in order to escape it. But then the Lord humbled me, and in my pride and arrogance and lack of understanding, He brought it about so I could understand how someone would consider suicide as a way to escape conflict. And to be clear, I never wanted to commit suicide. I never desired to commit suicide, and I never thought about how I could or how I would commit suicide if I was going to. But there was one night where the thought of death came to mind, and death presented itself as a source of comfort and rest amidst suffering and pain. So, like in regards to spiritual abuse, emotional abuse, conflict, people who use conflict as a tool to maintain control, like that brings about suffering and pain. And there was one night where, being amidst that suffering and pain, where the thought of death came to mind, and when death presented itself, there was an appeal. It presented itself as comfort and rest. It's like you can't escape this pain, you can't escape this conflict, you're surrounded by it. And it's like, well, death is one way I could. There's comfort, there's rest, there's reprieve from this suffering. But I never wanted to commit suicide. But I could see how people would. And then I have Psalm 94:17. If the Lord had not been my help, my soul would soon have dwelt in the abode of silence. Psalm 119:71. It was good for me that I was afflicted, that I may learn your statutes. And then verse 92. If your law had not been my delight, then I would have perished in my affliction. Because sometimes, like, if there's a woman and she's suicidal, it's like, oh, she's emotional, she has these mental health issues. It's like she's the source of her suffering that moves her to commit suicide. I don't think people consider, like, well, what's the environment that she was in? Was there anything happening in her environment that caused this emotional distress, this emotional turmoil that moved her to want to commit suicide as a way to escape the environment that she's in? It's always like, oh, she committed suicide. She needed help. We told her she needed help and she didn't get it. It's like she's the source of her emotional distress. It's not, the source isn't like from the people that is around her. It's like, oh, she didn't, it's unbelief, she didn't have joined the Lord. She, suicide, it's, oh, she was given over to her sin and she believed the lies and she ended her life. It's like, oh, she fell weakness to her sin that moved her to commit suicide. It's never considered like, oh, what was happening around her that afflicted her spirit and broke her heart and crushed her soul to the point where she was moved to perform this act to end her life. And like, yeah, in regards to divorce, like, when does divorce occur in a marriage? Is it when a husband deals treacherously? Is it when, the civil magistrate issues a certificate of divorce? So for me, in the situation that I was in, this is what I did to make my divorce official. Because there were many factors in my circumstance where, according to my conscience and like the standards of God. It's like this union is severed. This covenant is severed. There's not a union. There's not a marriage here. In substance, like we're separated. We're not married. So instead of taking the path of getting a religious leader to see and validate my issue and confirm that I had biblical reasons for divorce and confirm it was the right decision and support me through the process, I took a shortcut and changed my name back to my maiden name with the Social Security office. So I just went to the Social Security office and I changed my name back to my maiden name. And that made it official in my mind. It was already official, like in the eyes of God, but I just did this as like to make it open. And this was back in July 28th, 2025. I made the appointment and the name change was August 14th, 2025. So that's when I made it official and publicly known that I was no longer married, and that we were separated, and that marriage wasn't, we were no longer married. So my reasons, well, I was dealt treacherously against, and there is death in that I experienced according to biblical standards, I believe, in the eyes of God. And I think it was an unlawful union to begin with, and that I was misguided by false teachers on what marriage is and how to discern and what's a union wrought by God. And yeah, and I think there was deception and deceit, and I don't think my vows were valid. Like, you have to give them to a person that you know. I don't think I truly knew who that other person was. Yeah. So here's a list of names. Help I sought or received regarding conduct in the marriage. So these are people that I sought help from or I received help from regarding conduct in the marriage. So Mark Bashir, Cornerstone Baptist Church; Ryan Gromowitz, Cornerstone Baptist Church; Mark Mudge, Antorcha; Michael Dinger, I don't know where he's at now. He was at Faith Reformed Baptist Church. I don't know where he's at. Russ Jarvis, Art Mink, they're from Faith Reformed Baptist Church; and Matthew Borgstrom from Redeemer Bible Church. So I sought help from like Michael, Mark Mudge, Mark Bashir, Matthew Borgstrom. But like Russ Jarvis and Art Mink, I didn't specifically seek help from them, but I did receive, it was a different situation, and they spoke about the conduct in the marriage. So I did receive help from them. So that's why I have those two different verbs. Because some people I sought help and I didn't receive anything. But like Russ and Art, it's like, well, I did receive interaction and involvement from them, even though I didn't seek help from them. So that's why there's a distinction. So there's other names of people that were involved regarding spiritual care conduct in the marriage. I would not recommend any. Did not help. And their involvement wrought additional harm. And I would avoid Michael Dinger at all costs. And here's Josh Thames. He wrote this. This was when they were counseling me to go to a mental therapist to seek help, to talk to a therapist in regards to mental issues. So I asked Josh to write a list of what he's perceived in me so I can go give it to the counselor. So this is the intro of what he wrote. She used to be this way. There's dramatic changes seemed to happen after her second child and through some very traumatic interactions with influential religious people. So Josh Thames agrees that, through the interactions that were traumatic with these influential religious people, trauma occurred, change occurred, harm occurred, that resulted in me needing to seek care for mental health issues now. So, yeah, would not recommend any. They didn't help. I would avoid Michael Dinger at all costs. Some of my last conversations with Matthew. So this is why personally, I don't have a huge conviction over what people describe as curse words, like using F-U-C-K, B-I-T-C-H, S-H-I-T. Like, I do think it's mature language. I don't think I would say it in front of children, but I don't think that's a curse word. Like, I don't think it's wicked speech, and here's why. So here is an email that I sent to Matthew in response to an email he sent to me, saying how I was like guilty of wicked and vulgar speech and I needed to repent of it. Because I said the F-bomb. It was in a conversation where Mitchell said, "That's how you interpreted that?" When we were having a conversation, I was like, "Well, you said this." And he's like, "That's how you interpreted that?" And then I said, "As if there's any other way to fucking interpret it." So I said the F-bomb then as an expletive. But I had already apologized and sought forgiveness. So this is the context of him saying that I need to repent of like wicked and vulgar speech because of the F-bomb in that context. So here I'm asking, can you clarify how you would quantify wicked and vulgar speech? Is it the letter combination of certain words or the value those words hold? In this correspondence, as well as past correspondence and counseling sessions, you have taken the ivory of God's word, his power, his horn, and have accused me of sins that you permit Mitchell to tear through without any accountability or expectations, goring me left and right with false accusations, not discerning between good and evil, making baseless assertions, trampling me and overpowering me with your words. It kind of pulls from Ezekiel 34 about false shepherds, like they're beasts, the harmful beasts. So I talked about like his pattern, his conduct, and I used like that bull type imagery. If I summarized this and stated it's the work, product, refuse of bulls, is that permissible biblical language, or would it still be considered vulgar due to holding the same meaning as bullshit? Like, is wicked speech the combination of letters, like bullshit, or is it the concept of what those words contain? Like, if I said, this is the refuse of bulls, is that permissible? Or is it the same as bullshit? So that's what I responded to what I sent to Matt. He sent a reply that is in accord with how you would expect one to reply to that email. But I thought it was really funny, and I still laugh about it. And after I sent this email, Severance, that show Severance was on, I think season 2. And then that was after this, the next episode was when Seth had that interaction where he says, devour feculence, like eat shit, but he says it with like proper wording. So after this email and then seeing that, I thought it was kind of funny. But yeah, like saying like this is bullshit, like if that's if me saying it's bullshit is the biggest issue in your mind as opposed to your conduct of that's equative to bullshit, like the conduct is the bigger issue. The combination of letters that I use over that conduct, I don't think that should be someone's concern. If I think Matt's marriage counseling was bullshit, I think the concern would be, what's he doing in marriage counseling? As opposed to, Rebecca, you cursed. I don't think SHIT isn't a curse, isn't a curse word. It might be mature language or vulgar speech, but yep, I think the focus should be on what happened that would make someone call it that. Also, a blessing for Matt. I don't think your understanding and use of wicked speech is in accord with the Bible. Yes, it's a biblical term, but you're misusing it. Like for him to say, like when I dropped the F-bomb, that I was guilty of wicked and vulgar speech, like I don't think that expletive is wicked speech. I think you're misusing it. I think wicked speech, as defined by the Bible, would be lying, false accusations, blasphemy, arrogance. Like in James, all such speech is evil, and giving a false testimony. So I think you're actually more guilty of wicked speech than I am. So if you disagree, we can meet face to face and we can go over the history and talk about it. From my experience, Matthew's a keyboard warrior. He doesn't like talking face to face. He just wants to send some emails and keep you at arm's length and not actually have a discussion about this and meet face to face, because it's like, it's how they dodge accountability. Yep, so I think, Matthew, I think you're more guilty of wicked speech than what you accused me of. You rendered me guilty of wicked speech, but I think you're more guilty. So retributive justice, I think, with the judgment you give, it's going to be given to you. I would seek to repent of that before Judgment Day. He also said that I couldn't make claims regarding sins such as gaslighting, and that I needed to use the biblical term of deception. And this was directly after he gave a really good sermon, I'll admit, on the sin of simony. So he gave this sermon about Simon the sorcerer, and it talks about the sin of simony, and then he defines it with like the definition from Webster. So like simony, the sin of simony is not a biblical term, and he has a whole sermon about it. But when I brought up gaslighting, it's like, no, Rebecca, you can't talk about that. That's not biblical language. Yeah. So, and then, like, why would I say avoid Michael Dinger at all costs? So, like, here's some of my interaction with Michael Dinger during counseling. So, this is when I was postpartum, and I asked him, can you call Mitchell today for a pep talk? And he asked what's going on. I said, I'm doing okay. Mitchell isn't doing well. You can read through it. I talk about how I make some requests, and he responds. But yeah, you can pause it and read through it. And then Michael's response, thank you. I did call him and text him. I'm waiting to hear back. I may say with love and gentleness, you probably are oversensitive, exhausted, and having a difficult time. That is a natural thing after childbirth, and you have to be seriously on guard against sin. I would encourage you to do your best to get sleep when you can, and say things that can, and do not say things that can be interpreted as critical, but consider one another. Remember that you are not the only one who is tired, trying to care for 2 kiddos and a spouse, and under peculiar temptation right now. Like I tell him I'm okay, but I don't think Mitchell's doing well. And his response is that he thinks I probably am oversensitive and exhausted. It's like let's make women's emotions the problem. Let's make postpartum the problem instead of someone's conduct. Here's another interaction. Michael texted, hey guys, thinking of you. How have the both of you been lately? So Mitchell responds, hey brother, we're doing well. Saying both of us are doing well. I don't intend to speak for Rebecca, but you do. You did. But I feel we're doing well. And then here's my response. Hey, Michael, I'm doing well. Our communication and conflict is still terrible, but I'm addressing what I need to address while viewing it from a different lens. From my perspective, Mitchell is still incredibly unapproachable, demonstrates little desire to understand me or my views, and is unwilling to consider even small forms of correction. My mindset now is it's not wrong for me to desire healthy communication in a marriage, to feel heard and understood, and to have relational needs met, but that marriage entails being willing to sacrifice your desires and wants. I think they're needs, like emotional needs, relational needs. Like here I say that they're, wants, but I think they're needs. So then he asked, like, oh, have you read any books on this? And then here's the books I'm reading, putting in the work, and his response, never heard of those. Where did you hear about them? I give a response, and then Michael's response, I would not recommend receiving counsel through books from someone who has a secular mindset, even if they say some good things. I would stick to the Bible for your marital tips and very, very solid Christian books. So it's like, I have seen several times where people go to the world for their wisdom, and the people begin to think very worldly. I've seen it with subjects like relationships, communication, emotions, or conflict resolution. So Michael's claimed that he's never heard of these books, but he knows kind of what they're about. I think the 7 Principles of Making Marriage Work, about emotional intelligence. But it's like if you're giving marriage counseling and you have someone like putting in the work and they're like, oh, these are the books that I'm reading. Like it's kind of strange to dissuade someone against reading those books and not provide an alternative. Like if you're counseling someone and they're like reading these books and putting in their work, like if you think they're so bad, I would provide an alternative instead of saying like, oh, these are worldly, I wouldn't read them, or else, that might not end well for you. Yeah. And not provide an alternative. Kind of strange, Michael. But considering the course of your counseling to me in that time and your treatment of me, that I would describe as emotional abuse, psychological abuse, and spiritual abuse. And now having understood the effects of what that abuse can make someone feel and the effects that harm can cause on someone, and considering your past, I also say this with love and gentleness. If your conduct and behavior towards me and other women, because you've been a counselor with other marriages where the woman had the same symptoms, effects, suffering, pain, where like suicide seemed like an escape in order to remove themselves from the situation. And it's like you're the common denominator. You were the counselor at that time. So if your conduct and behavior towards me and other women was present in previous relationships you've been in, your emotional abuse probably played a part in the fate of your late wife. I know that her death was self-inflicted. And I know you have reasons for why she might have been moved to bring that upon herself. But if your conduct towards her was in any way similar to your conduct towards me and your conduct towards other women that I know, well, I think your conduct probably played a part in why she felt that was her only way out. So I think there's a potential that you hold guilt for her death. So I say that with love and gentleness too, Michael. And the fact that I've had several meetings with you about these issues with a group of people, and you've dismissed them and you didn't understand it, and you don't understand the emotional harm that you were inflicting upon me, since you were oblivious to the consequences of how your conduct was towards me when I brought these issues up to you, it makes me think like, oh, they probably were present in the past, and they probably did play a part to some extent for why your late wife suffered that fate. Counsel for women. So if you are in an abusive marriage of some kind, emotionally, spiritually, psychologically, physically, well, horrible situations like that are an opportunity to be blessed. And here is 1 Peter 2. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor if for the sake of conscience towards God, a person bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. So if you receive suffering unjustly, God will bring a blessing of joy and gladness in order to bring about justice. So if you endure patiently a season of suffering and affliction and pain and harm, and it's unjust, we'll know that God is, that finds favor with God, and God will bring about justice, and he can't undo the suffering that you received. So in order to balance the scales, he will bring gladness and joy through different means in order to bring about justice. If you have a husband or pastor that is controlling through the means of false accusations, instead of denying it and defending yourself, seek understanding. So, that was a common thing that I saw. It's like I would be accused falsely of certain sins, make certain claims. You did this, you did that, you're guilty, blah, blah, blah. I would be falsely accused of all of these sins. And it's like my response in the beginning, it's like, no, I'm not. And I would defend myself. But then when I was reading the Peacemaker book, I started seeking understanding. Well, if I'm blind, let me consider their perspective. So instead of denying the claims that they would make, I would seek understanding. Help me understand. You're saying that I'm this way. I'm not going to deny it, but help me understand. And then it's like you search for understanding, and then there's no understanding to be found. There's no conviction. There's nothing to understand. So that was helpful for me. You kind of see the tactics behind it. But it does disarm, the narcissist if they use tactics like this to maintain control. So here's a response. And this was someone made a list of accusations against me. So my response: thanks. I read your list to the lady. We both didn't know what you meant by a few things. Can you set aside some time for me to ask what you meant by a few things? That way I can clarify on my next visit. And then I asked again, do you have time to talk about your notes? So this person made accusations against me that I believe were false. And then instead of saying this isn't true, I just asked hey, there's a few things I don't understand. I'd like to seek understanding. Can we meet to discuss these things? Their response, blank said that he doesn't want to cause any further issues. He said sorry if it was confusing. So then you can kind of see it's like they fold. If they make a false accusation and it's oh, I disagree, help me understand your perspective. It's oh, now all of a sudden, no, it's okay, I don't have to explain it. And then my response, thanks, blank, you're not causing issues. It's not that your words are confusing, I'm just seeking additional details to further understand your perspective. So that's one way that you could, if you have a husband, pastor, or friends that are controlling through false accusations, just seek understanding. And then you'll see they can't, there's no understanding to give because it's just unfounded accusations. So that's the end of this video. I didn't expect it to go this long, but hopefully that's helpful for women who are single, getting married, currently married, needing marriage counseling, some questions to ask potential spouse, husband, pastor, marriage counselor, just to see where their mind is so you know what to expect. Okay, Thanks. Bye.